Listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
At 6 p.m. on Friday, December 17, 2010, a 25-year-old woman named Jo Yates sat drinking and listening to Christmas music at the Bristol Ram pub with some of her co-workers in Bristol, England. Jo, who was a landscape architect, and her co-workers were regulars at this pub. But tonight, they were there specifically to celebrate an early Christmas together. Jo sipped her cider and looked out the window at the falling snow. The sun had just set, and the snowflakes seemed to glow under the streetlights. This, along with the holiday decorations on the shops outside, made the whole street look like the cover of a Christmas card. Jo looked away from the window and joined in on the conversation with her coworkers, who were talking about their various holiday plans. Jo said she was very excited because this was the first Christmas she was going to spend with her boyfriend, Greg Reardon. Greg had gone on a weekend trip, but when he got back, they were going to spend a week with their family and then travel, just the two of them, to Scotland for Hogmanay, which is like a Scottish New Year's celebration. As Jo spoke about Greg, she couldn't help but smile. A few years earlier, she'd been a university student just trying to figure out what she was going to do with her life. And now she had a great job, she had a perfect little flat, and the man that she loved, Greg, had recently started talking about getting married. Life was perfect. At about 8 p.m., so 2 hours after Jo had gotten to the pub, she wished all her coworkers a happy Christmas. She got up from the table, put on her long cream-colored coat, and headed outside into the snow. It was cold, about 27 degrees Fahrenheit, or almost -3 degrees Celsius, but Jo was used to the winter weather. She pulled her coat collar up around her neck and started walking home to her flat, which was about a 30-minute walk away. After walking for a while, Jo ducked into a convenience store to grab a frozen pizza, and then after that, she went into a small shop called Bargain Booze and bought 2 bottles of cider. And so now, with her food and drinks in hand, Jo continued the walk home. She knew her flat would feel empty without Greg there, but she was still looking forward to spending a relaxing Friday night with her cider and her pizza, and of course, her cat. A little after 8:45 p.m., Jo finally approached her flat, which was a basement unit in an old stone house. Jo and Greg's landlord, a retired English teacher, lived in the unit right above them. Jo unlocked the outside door that led directly into her flat, and then she walked inside and put her food and drinks on the kitchen counter. She took off her coat and hung it on a hook near the door, slipped off her boots, and then called for her cat. But after calling for him, she didn't hear him clacking across the hardwood floor like she expected. She looked all around the flat, but she couldn't find him anywhere. Jo shook her head and went back to the kitchen. Her and Greg's cat was a bit of an escape artist. He frequently got out. Their landlord had found their cat in his place upstairs several times, and also, the cat had even made it across the small front garden to their next-door neighbor's place before. And so Jo felt confident the cat would come home when it got too cold, and so for now, she just grabbed a cider, cracked it open, and sat down in the front room. And after she'd only taken a couple of sips, she heard a knock on the door. Jo hoped it was her landlord returning her cat, so she got out of her chair, opened the door, and when she saw who was there, she gave a huge smile. On the night of December 19th, so 2 days after Jo had met her coworkers at the pub, her boyfriend Greg got back to their flat after being gone for the weekend. He unlocked the flat door, walked inside, and put his bag down on the floor. He was about to call out for Jo, but he heard a strange sound coming from the kitchen. His and Jo's cat was meowing, but it sounded like the animal was afraid or angry. Greg walked into the kitchen, and he saw the cat pacing back and forth in front of an empty food bowl. This was really strange, because Jo always made sure that bowl was full. And so Greg scooped some cat food out of the bag, dumped it in the cat's bowl, and then walked to the bedroom looking for Jo. However, she wasn't there. Greg figured she must have gone out with friends or something. He had messaged her when he was heading home, and he hadn't heard back yet, but he really hadn't thought much about it. However, when he stepped back into the front room, he actually looked around for the first time, and at this point, he did start to get worried. Greg saw Jo's coat, her boots, and her purse right there in the room. He knew how cold it was, and so Jo would never have left, at least not without her coat, and she definitely would not leave her purse behind. Greg grabbed his phone and called Joe, and as he did, he suddenly felt a chill come over him because he heard the sound of her phone ringing inside of her coat pocket right in front of him. Now, Greg started to panic. Joe was one of those people who never went anywhere without her phone. And so he immediately dialed 999, the emergency number in the UK, and he told the operator that his girlfriend, Jo Yates, was missing. In the early morning of December 20th, about 4 hours after Greg called 999, Detective Inspector Joe Goff of the Avon and Somerset Police walked into the flat. D.I. Goff had been a police officer for over 20 years, and as such, he'd learned to remain even-keeled in almost every situation. He spoke in a soft, low voice, and the look on his face almost never gave anything away. Goff greeted a few uniformed officers who had arrived before him and walked over to Greg, who was standing in the front room looking frightened. The detective understood why Greg might be upset, but he didn't want to jump to any conclusions. Now, it was clear Greg's girlfriend had not been home when Greg got there, but besides that, the police didn't have a whole lot of information about what was even going on here. And so Goff introduced himself to Greg and asked him when was the last time he spoke to his girlfriend. Greg said that he had seen Jo a couple days earlier before he left town, but he hadn't talked to her since. Goff asked if it was odd that he would go 2 full days without speaking to his girlfriend. But Greg just shook his head and said no. He'd been busy while he was gone, and he figured Jo had been busy too, getting ready for Christmas, so that's why he must have missed her when he'd called. While Goff listened to Greg, he scanned the room. He could see Jo's coat, boots, and purse. Just like Greg, he did think it was strange that Jo would go out and leave all of those things behind. But still, this didn't prove a crime had occurred here. Goff also noticed 2 cider bottles sitting on a small table. One had a couple of sips gone, and the other looked untouched. Goff asked Greg if there was anything about Jo, like physical attributes or places she liked to frequent, that might point police in the right direction as they began this search for her. Greg gave a basic description of Jo. He said she was average height, had short blonde hair, and blue eyes. And he said she'd been hanging out with coworkers the night he left town at a pub called the Bristol Ram. Goff jotted all of this down in his notebook, got details of where Greg had spent the weekend, and then joined a couple of officers in the kitchen. After spending a few hours in the flat, Goff and the other officers had not found anything that stood out to them. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle, and at least according to Greg, the front door had been locked when he got home. Goff told his team to speak to the landlord who lived upstairs, and also to Jo's other neighbors, to see if anyone had seen her in the last couple of days. For now, Goff was treating this as a missing persons case that he hoped would have a clear explanation and a happy ending. For all he knew, Jo had just left town without telling her boyfriend. Maybe she was with the person she'd gotten one of those ciders for. And maybe she took a different coat and purse with her and accidentally forgot her phone. I mean, it was just a thought, but either way, Goff felt confident he could retrace Jo's steps from the moment she left the pub and he could find her. Later that day, Goff sat at the station poring over CCTV surveillance footage from locations between the Bristol Ram pub and Jo's flat. Britain has more surveillance cameras per person than almost any other country in the world. This is why Goff felt so confident he'd be able to see exactly where Jo had gone on the last night anybody had heard from her. And he would be right. Using footage from storefront and street cameras, Goff followed Jo's walk out of the pub and through Bristol. Footage from inside the convenience store showed her buying the pizza, and he saw her go into Bargain Booze and walk out with 2 bottles of cider. Goff later picked her up on a street camera in her neighborhood that showed her walking towards her flat. So, it looked like Jo had just gone home after going to the pub, and Goff could see she was wearing the coat and carrying the purse that had been found inside of her flat. However, Goff couldn't find any surveillance footage that showed Jo back on the street after she had gotten home. It was like she had gone inside of her flat and then just vanished. And when the entire day went by without any of Jo's friends or family hearing from her, Goff began to think that Jo very likely did not just ditch her boyfriend and leave town. And so Goff went to meet with Jo's parents, and when he did, he suggested they reach out to the press for some help. On December 21st, 2 days after Greg had reported Joe missing, Joe's parents went on the local news. They said they loved their daughter dearly, and they asked anyone who might have helpful information to please come forward. By the following day, Joe's story had hit the major newspapers in London, and her picture was being shown on TV news programs all throughout the United Kingdom. And soon, the story of the pretty young missing woman had become a public obsession. At 9 a.m. on Christmas morning, so over a week after Joe had gone missing, a couple was walking their dog down a snow-covered street that was about 3 miles away from Joe's flat. All of a sudden, the dog stopped, sniffed the air, and then looked over to the side of the road. The couple glanced in the direction the dog was staring, but all they could see was a stone wall standing several feet high that separated the road they were on from a field filled with trees on the other side. The man tugged on his dog's leash to try to get the dog moving, but his wife told him to actually stop, and then she walked over to the wall and knelt down to see what was there. And when she looked, she saw something bright buried beneath the snow in a pile of leaves. And as she leaned in closer, she screamed. A few minutes later, several police cars came to a stop on the road where the couple and the dog were waiting. Goff got out of his car and walked right past the couple towards that wall. On the ground, he could see part of a brightly colored t-shirt and a frozen blue human arm. Goff put on his gloves, and he was quickly joined by several forensics officers. And together, they carefully dug into the snow and leaves until they revealed the frozen dead body of a young woman. As soon as he saw her, Goff closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He really was almost always unflappable, but seeing something like this, on Christmas of all days, just shattered him. Goff walked away from the body, collected himself, and then he called Joe's parents to tell them he believed he had just found their daughter's body. Later that morning, after the body had been positively identified as Joe's, Goff and several forensics officers stood by the wall, staring down at Joe. Goff wondered if maybe this was just a terrible accident. Maybe Joe had left her flat in a rush without her coat on, slipped on the snowy ground, and suffered some sort of injury that killed her, or that immobilized her and then she died of exposure. And because it had been snowing, her body would have quickly been covered and would have gone unnoticed. As Goff crouched down and searched the area around Joe's body, a few pieces of evidence jumped out at him. Joe was clothed, however, her shirt had been pulled up around her neck, exposing one of her breasts. He also saw bruising on her throat. And so right away, this did not seem like something that would happen from a fall. It looked like something that would happen in a sexual assault. Also, Goff noticed that Joe had on only one sock, but more specifically, he saw the bottom of her bare foot and the bottom of the sock on the other foot were totally clean. There was no dirt, no leaves, or any other sign that she'd been walking around in this area. It was like she'd been dropped here. Goff heard somebody call his name, and he turned to see a forensic biologist crouched down looking at the wall nearby, gesturing to him. Goff joined her, and she immediately pointed to a section of the wall. Goff looked, and he saw there were bloodstains running vertically up this one section of the wall, almost from the very top to the bottom. He looked at the forensic biologist, a bit confused. She told him that these stains were not the kind of blood spatter that would occur from an attack. Instead, these were stains that would have been left when someone tried to lift Joe's bloody body over the wall and failed. Goff stood up and peered over the wall. On the other side was just a big field full of trees. Had someone been able to actually dump Joe's body onto the other side of the wall, meaning had they not failed to get her over, there was no telling how long it would have taken for someone to finally find her. Goff exhaled, and he could see his breath hanging in the air. The way Joe's body had been found, and the bloodstain on the wall, made it pretty clear this was no accident. He now had a murder investigation on his hands. Goff also felt sure that Joe had not been walking along this road when she died. So his first thought was that she had been murdered somewhere else, probably near her flat, and then driven and dumped here. Goff knew the forensics team had a lot of work to do. However, they seemed very optimistic that the snow and the low temperatures had helped preserve the body, and so they hoped they'd be able to find blood or other DNA samples that might lead them to Joe's killer. So Goff left them to it, got in his car, and headed back to the station. Now that he was investigating a murder, he knew where he had to start, with Joe's boyfriend, Greg. That night, so Christmas night, Goff sat across from Greg inside of an interview room, and the young man looked like a total wreck. He told Goff this was supposed to be the first Christmas he and Joe were going to spend together, and he couldn't believe this was happening. However, as upset as Greg was, he was very cooperative throughout the interview. He gave Goff all the details of his weekend trip again, he again told the story of what had happened when he first came home, and he agreed to submit DNA samples. After that, Goff let Greg go. Since Greg was the victim's boyfriend, the detective would not completely cross him off the suspect list. However, Goff had already followed up on Greg's alibi after they met that first time, and it had checked out. Also, because there was no surveillance footage of Joe after she had gone inside of her flat and then disappeared, Goff believed the only person who could have carried out this murder would be somebody who lived basically inside of that building that the flat was in, because that's the only way they would escape being seen on camera going in and out of her place. And because this case was now all over the news, lots of other people in the United Kingdom were beginning to speculate the same thing. The killer must have been inside of that building when Joe went into her flat. But before Goff could even decide what to do about this theory, he got a phone call. On the other end of the line, he heard the sound of an older man's voice who was speaking with a very proper, posh English accent, and this man quickly introduced himself as Chris Jeffries, Joe and Greg's landlord and upstairs neighbor. And Chris told Goff that he had seen the news about the discovery of Joe's body, and he believed he had information that would help. He said on the night Joe went missing, he had seen a few people he did not recognize walking along the side of the house. In the days following this phone call, Goff followed up on the details of Chris's story, and the detective got the feeling that the landlord was not telling him the whole truth. The landlord, Chris, had been aware of the investigation since the moment police showed up after the 999 call. In fact, members of Goff's investigative team had taken a statement from Chris because he owned the building Joe lived in and was her upstairs neighbor. Now it struck Goff that during that initial meeting, Chris had not mentioned these strangers he'd supposedly seen near the house. Chris had also told investigators that on the night Joe went missing, he said he'd spent the entire night at home. However, since that initial conversation, Goff had reviewed additional surveillance footage. And late on the night of December 17th, the last night anyone had seen Joe alive, Goff saw a car on that footage that looked a lot like Chris's car driving across a nearby suspension bridge, indicating he had not been home the whole time. So, on December 30th, 5 days after Joe's body was discovered, Goff met Chris at the police station and escorted him directly to an interview room. Chris had long white hair, and he wore a sports coat and carried this small leather satchel. He sort of looked like an eccentric professor. Goff sat down at a small table across from Chris and asked him how his relationship with Joe had been. Did he have any issues with her? But Chris just shook his head. He said Joe and Greg were a nice couple and good tenants. He said the worst he could say about them was that sometimes their cat got out and found its way upstairs to his place. Goff asked Chris what he'd been doing on the night of December 17th, the night that Joe went missing. Chris immediately looked confused. He said he'd been home the whole night and hadn't seen anything unusual, just like he'd already told police. Now, Goff didn't raise his voice or even change his facial expression, but he said to Chris, "Hey, that's not true." Chris had called and said on the phone that he had noticed some unusual strangers walking by the house. And so he asked Chris, why hadn't he told the police about those people when they first spoke to him? Now, a worried look came across Chris's face. He said he had only come here to help, but now it felt like he was being accused of something. But Goff just asked him again, why hadn't he told the police about the people he saw by the house? Chris kind of shook it off. He said it was the holidays and people in the neighborhood were having parties, so it didn't seem strange to him at the time that people were walking by the house. For a minute, there was just silence between the two men. And then Goff finally said, on December 17th, surveillance cameras had caught a car that looked just like Chris's car driving across the suspension bridge that was the main route between Joe's flat and the location where her body was found. Chris looked totally stunned. He said there had to be a mistake. He never left his flat that night. It was too dangerous, it was snowing and the roads were bad, so he didn't want to leave his house. At this point, Goff just excused himself and walked out of the room. In all honesty, he really didn't know if Chris was guilty. Chris had easy access to Joe's flat, and that car on the surveillance footage could possibly be his. This was just too much to ignore, and so Goff needed a bit more time to fully dig into Chris's background and his seemingly flimsy alibi. Under British law, in the case of serious crimes like murder, police can apply to a magistrate to hold potential suspects for 36 hours without charging them. Goff felt confident a magistrate would allow him to hold Chris. And Goff was right. That night, police arrested Chris, took a DNA sample, and transferred him to a jail cell in a nearby facility. And for the first time, Goff felt like he had a legitimate suspect. The following morning, which was New Year's Eve, Goff sat at his desk staring at the front pages of multiple tabloid newspapers. Goff was very annoyed, because despite all of his team's efforts to hide it, news about Chris's arrest had gotten out. Goff flipped open one of the papers, and as soon as he did, he got even more upset. The paper had basically decided that Chris had murdered Joe. It was not just that he was arrested, but no, he was the killer. And their proof? Well, just how he looked and how he spoke. However, as upset as Goff was about this, the tabloid headlines actually ended up benefiting his investigation. Because that morning, while Goff waited to secure a search warrant for Chris's flat, he got a phone call. This caller said his name was Vincent Tabak, and he lived in the building right next to Joe's that also happened to be owned by Chris. Vincent said he had seen Chris's car earlier that night facing one direction, and the following morning, Chris's car was facing the opposite direction. When Goff heard this, he started to get excited. If he could prove Chris was lying about staying home on the night Joe went missing, he might be able to definitively link Chris's car to the one he'd seen on the suspension bridge in the surveillance footage. After Goff hung up, he immediately asked a detective on his team to follow up with Vincent to see if he might have seen or heard anything else that night. And then soon after that, Goff got the approval for his search warrant, and so he and his team headed over to Chris's upstairs flat. It was New Year's Eve, and as Goff drove across town, he believed he might actually be able to close this case before people all across the country popped open champagne bottles and welcomed in 2011. When Goff and his team walked inside of Chris's upstairs flat, it felt like they'd stepped into a library. The walls were lined with shelves that were overflowing with old books. Goff told his team to split up and begin their search, and it didn't take long before one of them called out from the kitchen. And so Goff and the other officers walked into the kitchen, and they found that officer sitting on the floor holding something that he'd found tucked under one of the kitchen cabinets. When Goff bent down to get a better look, he thought he was looking at the smoking gun that would wrap this case up, because the officer on the floor was holding a pair of trainers, the British word for tennis shoes, and one of these trainers looked like it was stained with blood. Even the normally calm and collected Goff could not hide his excitement. Between this shoe, the call from the next-door neighbor, and the surveillance footage from the bridge, Goff felt like he was close to having enough evidence to build a strong case against Chris. And so officers bagged the trainer and had it sent off to the crime lab for expedited testing. And by the following day, which was New Year's Day of 2011, the lab came back with the test results. And on the same day, the lab also reported that they had run tests on DNA samples they'd found on Joe's clothes and skin. And when all these test results came in, Goff knew that they had found Joe's killer. Based on DNA evidence, surveillance footage, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, Here is what police believe happened to Joe Yates on the night of December 17th, 2010. Around 8:45 p.m., the killer stood outside of Joe's front door holding her cat. The killer clutched the cat close to their chest so it wouldn't dart off, and then knocked on Joe's door. Joe opened the door, saw the cat, and immediately smiled. She apologized for the cat's behavior and thanked the killer for bringing her cat back. The killer said it was no problem, leaned in through her door and put the cat down, and as the cat trotted off towards Joe's kitchen, the killer lunged at Joe, pushed her further into the front room, and slammed the door behind them. Joe screamed, but the killer immediately covered her mouth while they shoved her through the flat towards the bedroom. Joe tried to fight back, but it was happening so quickly, and the killer threw her onto the bed, pulled her shirt up around her neck, and grabbed at her chest. Joe struggled, and one of her socks fell off in the fight. The killer tried to keep her pinned down, but Joe let out this loud scream, desperately hoping somebody would hear her and save her. The killer panicked and punched her in the face. Blood ran down Joe's cheeks. Then the killer just wrapped their hands around Joe's throat and squeezed. They sat on top of Joe, strangling her violently for over 20 seconds until Joe stopped breathing and died. The killer got off the bed and walked to the front room. They could hear the cat walking around in the kitchen, but other than that, there wasn't any noise coming from the outside. The killer took a steadying breath, hoping they had somehow managed to keep Joe quiet enough to not get detected. And so the killer just sort of stood there for a long time, listening and planning their next move. About an hour after the killer had arrived at Joe's, they went back into the bedroom, picked up Joe, and carried her to the front door. With Joe in their arms, the killer opened the door, quickly locked it from the inside, then they stepped outside and closed the door behind them. Then they rushed to their car, opened up the trunk, and dropped Joe's body inside. Then the killer got in their car and sped across town in the snow. When they reached a dark, empty road with a wall running alongside it, they pulled over and got out. They scanned the street and saw nobody was nearby, so they carefully opened up the trunk, picked Joe up, and carried her over to the side of the road near the wall. The killer tried to lift Joe's body over the wall, but they just couldn't do it. She was too heavy. And so her body slid down the wall, leaving bloodstains on the wall from her face and neck. Finally, the killer just dropped Joe onto the snowy ground. They piled more snow and leaves on top of her, and then ran back to their car and drove off. A few minutes later, they stepped back inside of their flat, hoping nobody had seen what they just did. Despite what some people in the media had already decided, Joe's landlord, Chris Jeffries, had nothing to do with Joe's murder. It would turn out Joe's next-door neighbor, Vincent Tabak, had killed her. Vincent was the one who had called police to say he believed that Chris, who also happened to be his landlord, had driven off in his car on the night Joe was killed, that he was lying about being in his flat the whole time. Vincent had called police after reading about Chris's arrest in the tabloid newspapers. He thought it was a great opportunity to distance himself from the crime and solidify the police's belief that Chris was the killer. Now, when Goff spoke to Vincent, he learned that Vincent was in the Netherlands celebrating Christmas, meaning he was not home. Now, this didn't mean he was guilty, but it struck Goff as just a little bit suspicious, and so he wanted to follow up with Vincent. So Goff contacted authorities in the Netherlands, and then Goff sent a detective from his team out to the Netherlands to meet with Vincent in person. Now, the interview itself did not provide any new information. However, the detective was able to get Vincent to submit a DNA sample. When the test results for the trainers that had been found in Chris's flat came in from the crime lab, it would turn out that even though there might have been blood on them, there was no connection to the murder at all. However, the DNA samples taken from Joe's body and clothes that the crime lab had just tested as well did match the sample that Vincent had provided. After these results, Goff went back to the surveillance footage of the suspension bridge that was near the road where Joe's body had been found. The car in that footage was not Chris's after all, and police would soon discover that Vincent had taken a different, less direct route to the road, which is why he was never seen on camera. Goff secured a warrant, and he and his team searched Vincent's apartment. While they didn't find any specific evidence pertaining to the crime there, Vincent had been watching violent pornography on his computer, most of which featured men assaulting women and strangling them. After police arrested Vincent, they would learn that he didn't really have any real relationship with Jo. He had just seen her around the neighborhood and thought she was pretty. He had also brought her cat back to her in the past. But over time, Vincent developed a violent obsession with Jo. He wanted to have sex with her and strangle her. And as Christmas of 2010 approached, Vincent decided he didn't want to wait any longer to act on this obsession. And when he saw Jo's cat outside on December 17th, he saw his opportunity. Vincent showed up at Jo's flat, returned her cat, and then killed her. Vincent was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years. As for Jo's landlord, Chris Jeffries, who was all but proclaimed guilty in much of the UK media, he's spoken at length in interviews, telling his side of the story and saying how all he had wanted to do was help the police solve a horrible crime.
On the afternoon of October 16, 1991, a 36-year-old man named Enrique Martinez bent down, pulled out his pocket knife, and he carefully cut through the stem of a mushroom that was growing right next to a mossy log. And then after freeing this mushroom, he put it inside of his wicker basket with the other mushrooms he had collected in the area. And then Enrique stood up and just took a minute to take in the unbelievable view of this lush green valley right below him. Enrique was out mushroom hunting along with his wife Anna and their two friends Jorge and Sofia, who were dating. And where they were mushroom hunting was near this old abandoned town called La Musara, which is located up in the mountains of northeastern Spain. It had been Jorge's idea to come to this area and explore. Jorge had heard all these crazy stories about La Musara, about how it was haunted, and there was all this creepy folklore surrounding this town. As for Enrique, he didn't really care about the lore surrounding this town. Frankly, the town was not that interesting to him. What was interesting was the opportunity to come out here and collect mushrooms. That was something he really liked to do. Enrique and his wife Anna lived in this very busy port city in Spain called Tarragona, and so their lives day to day were very hectic. Enrique, he worked at a bar as a bartender, and so every night he was surrounded by hundreds of people coming in and out, and so having a chance to come out here and be in nature at peace and collect these mushrooms just sounded too good to turn up. Enrique stopped staring at the valley right in front of him, and he turned around and continued to scan the mountainside for a particular type of mushroom that grew in this area. It was called the bloody milk cap, which was known to be great for grilling. It paired well with meat. And so Enrique's plan was to go out on this mushroom hunting trip. And when they got back, he wanted to cook a feast using these mushrooms for his wife and his friends. The group slowly made their way uphill until they finally saw the outskirts of the abandoned town, La Musara. La Musara was more than 900 years old, and now it was just a collection of crumbling ruins, some dating back to prehistoric times. La Musara had never been a big town. At its peak, it had about 300 residents. But the last of the remaining residents of this town had finally fled 40 years earlier, and so now it was a ghost town. The group made their way over to one of the buildings that was right on the outer perimeter of La Musara. It was basically just a foundation with 3 walls still standing. There was no roof, but the friends, they went over to this building, and from right next to it, they were able to look straight down the main drag of La Musara. It was basically just a dirt road that went straight out, and all along the road were other kind of ruined foundations of where buildings used to be. And fairly far down this road, maybe 200 feet away from where all the friends were standing, was the center of La Musara, which was marked by this big church with a huge steeple, and the church was actually in decent shape. It had not totally crumbled onto itself like the rest of the buildings around it. And then behind the church, somewhat visible from where the friends were standing, was this overgrown cemetery. And then kind of off to the side of the church was this pond that was also very overgrown, and it was full of croaking frogs. Enrique and his friends just stood there next to their dilapidated building, staring at La Musara in silence. Now, they knew this place was going to be very creepy. People had said it was haunted, and that was a big reason why Jorge wanted to come here. But now seeing it in person, really the creep factor was much higher than they expected. It really did look like a spooky place. And then adding to the spook factor was very clearly, as they were looking down this main road, the friends could see this mist kind of starting to envelop the town. Jorge had told the friends when he was doing his research about La Musara that the mist was really a trademark of this town, that at night it basically got completely consumed in white mist. But now the friends are looking down this road, it's the middle of the day, and already the mist is starting to come in. Finally, Jorge broke the silence and said, "Hey, I want to show you guys something." And he grabbed his girlfriend Sophia's hand and he began kind of jogging down the main road in the direction of the church. And so Enrique and Anna followed behind. And after only walking maybe 10 or 20 feet, Enrique happened to turn around and look back where they had just been standing next to this dilapidated building, and already he couldn't see that building because this fog had rolled in and totally obscured his view. Enrique couldn't help but feel a little uneasy, again, because he thought the fog was supposed to come in at night, and it's broad daylight, and here we are, totally covered in fog, but he shook it off, thinking, what's the big deal? And so Enrique turned back around, and he and Anna hustled to catch up with Jorge and Sofia, who by this point had stopped a little farther down the road, off to the side, where there was this strange rectangular rock that was maybe 2 feet tall, just kind of jutting up out of the ground. And when Enrique and Anna made it to Jorge and Sofia, Jorge placed his hand on the top of this strange rock, and looking very satisfied with himself, he would tell his friends, "This is the Sis Stone, and people say it contains dark powers." The Sis Stone was actually one of the oldest things in all of La Musara. Back in the day, Muslim armies used to march through La Musara, which actually got its name from this. La Musara means the place to march. And so these armies, as they would pass through La Musara, making their way to the valley down below, they would always stop at the Sis Stone because they believed it had magical powers that could help them defeat their enemies in their upcoming battles. Now, the Muslim armies were long gone by this point, but the Sis Stone was still there, and people still said that it contained that kind of magical power, that there were dark forces at work inside of the stone, and so to touch it was very risky. In fact, some people said if you touched the Sis Stone, you could be sucked into this parallel world full of all these demonic entities. And so as Jorge told the group about all this history surrounding the Sis Stone and how no one should touch it, remember, he's got his hands squarely on the Sis Stone the whole time. And so when he finishes telling this story, he looks at the others and said, "Come on, somebody else touch it." Jorge's girlfriend, Sofia, said, "Absolutely not. I'm not about to tempt evil spirits here." But Enrique's wife, Anna, said, "You know what? I'll touch it." And so Jorge smiled, he pulled his hand off the Sis Stone, and Anna, she walked forward, she took a deep breath, and then she placed her hand on the stone. And for a second, the whole group just held their breath, like something was going to reach out and grab Anna and pull her into the stone, but nothing happened, and a minute later, Anna had pulled her hand off, and the whole group was laughing. But just a couple of seconds later, Enrique, who had been laughing along with the group, suddenly noticed that the frogs in the pond near the church, a little farther down the road from where they were suddenly so much louder. It was almost like when they touched the stone, it had maximized the volume of these frogs. And so Enrique, he turned his whole body and began staring down the road through the mist and fog at this pond, and he could kind of barely make it out. He was trying to see if there was something obvious causing these frogs to kind of go crazy. But as he stared at this pond, which again he could barely see, right behind it was the church. But there was lots of fog kind of blocking the church, and for a second the fog kind of parted, and Enrique got a full shot of one of the windows of this abandoned church. And in the window was this dark figure just standing there staring at Enrique and his friends. And Enrique, he sees this thing in the window, and in a second it was gone. And then the fog rolled back in, covered up the window, and Enrique couldn't see anything anymore. And so Enrique just stood there in stunned silence, having no idea if what he just saw had really just happened or if it was in his imagination or something. But before he could even try to process what had just happened, he heard his name being called. And so he kind of snapped out of it and he turned back to the group, and it was Anna who was now jokingly saying, "Come on, Enrique, touch the stone too." Enrique quickly scanned Anna, Sophia, and Jorge's face, and they were all smiling and laughing still. And so clearly none of them had seen this figure in the window. And so Enrique, he kind of just looked at all of his friends, and then he looked back in the direction of the church and this window, which again, he couldn't see because the fog was blocking it out. And so Enrique just tells himself, okay, there's no way that I just saw some dark figure moving around this abandoned church. That must have been my imagination. I'm totally fine. And so he turned back to his friends, and he could tell they were not going to let it go until he touched this stone. And so he said, fine, and he walked up and he touched the stone. And immediately, as soon as his hand made contact with that stone, everything seemed to change. The air around Enrique got cooler, and the stone itself started to warm up. And as this happened, Enrique, whose hand was still on the stone, began to think, wow, I could do this for hours. I could just stay here and leave my hand on the stone. I mean, this is amazing. But then somewhere buried deep in his mind, Enrique began telling himself, get away from the stone. Take your hand away, get away right now. And so finally, Enrique did yank his hand away, and right away, all those feelings he was having as he touched the stone disappeared. The air went back to normal. He did not feel compelled to touch the stone, and he just kind of was left thinking, what just happened? And so Enrique's wife, Anna, along with Jorge, they were both grinning at Enrique, waiting for him to tell them about what it was like to touch the stone. But behind them, Sophia, Jorge's girlfriend, she was not happy. She was the only one who had not touched the stone. And so she spoke up and said, guys, let's get away from the stone. I don't want to continue to tempt evil spirits, okay? Let's just go. And so Jorge threw his arm around Sophia and told her to lighten up, and then said, come on, let's do some more exploring. And so Jorge took Sophia's hand, and he continued walking down the main road in the direction of the church, and Enrique's wife, Anna, she quickly followed right after them, kind of running to keep up, like she was a kid who was excited about what they were doing. But Enrique, he just stayed put for an extra second, because even though he had told himself that, whatever he saw in the window was nothing, he could not help the fact that as soon as he touched that stone, he felt different. There was something off about the stone, and really there seemed to be something off about this whole village, which by this point was now completely enveloped in fog. They were totally covered. Now, Enrique, at this point, did just want to leave La Musara. He didn't want to be there anymore. The place was totally creeping him out. But he didn't want to be a party pooper, and so he turned and continued walking down the main road after his friends and his wife. And after he walked a little ways, the fog parted enough that he could see the pond full of these very loud croaking frogs, as well as the church and that window where he had seen or supposedly seen this dark figure, but the window was empty. And Enrique was relieved to see that his friends clearly had not stopped at the church. They had not tried to go in. They had gone behind the church into the cemetery. Enrique did not want to go inside of the church because even though, again, he had told himself that, that figure wasn't real, it wasn't really in the window, still there was a part of him that wanted to stay far away from this building. But after Enrique walked past the pond and began side-skirting the church to get to the cemetery, he just stopped and turned and actually faced the window, kind of like involuntarily. He was looking at the window where this dark figure had been. And again, it's empty, there's nothing there, but Enrique felt like something was pulling him towards this window. And so without saying anything to his friends, who aren't really paying attention to Enrique, they're kind of just walking around the cemetery, Enrique walked right up to this window. He's right in front of it. He's looking inside, and now he can see into the actual church. And it's totally ruined inside, but he can see where the pews used to be on the ground, and he could also see where the pulpit used to be, where the priest would give mass. And as Enrique stood there staring into the church, he kept leaning closer and closer and closer into the church until finally he felt like he really wanted to move away and get away from the church, but it was like he couldn't. He just kept getting pulled into this opening. And then as this was happening, the sound of the frogs got louder and louder until Enrique felt like he was totally consumed by these frogs. Meanwhile, just around the corner of the church in back in the cemetery, Anna, Jorge, and Sophia were kind of laughing and walking around the cemetery, reading the different headstones, when at some point, Anna, Enrique's wife, just happened to look up when she realized Enrique was not there with them. And so Anna, she walked over to the gate of the cemetery and she looked up along the side of the church, and there was Enrique kind of leaning forward into this window looking into the church. And so Anna, she yelled out to him a couple of times, but Enrique did not even notice her or acknowledge her. He just continued leaning forward looking in this window. And finally, Anna got right up next to Enrique and she actually shook his shoulder. And when she did that, Enrique kind of snapped out of it and turned and looked at her, but didn't say anything. He just had this totally confused look on his face. And Anna, she looks up at her husband and she's like, come on, come into the cemetery. That's where everyone is. Come on. And then Anna turned and skipped towards the cemetery. And once Anna was back in the cemetery, she just got right back to walking around and looking at all the different headstones. And at some point, as she was looking at one particular headstone, she took a few steps back to get a better look at it, and she accidentally bumped into another headstone, a big cross that had a line drawn across it, and it fell to the ground and it broke. Jorge and Sophia heard the sound of this stone breaking in half, and they turned and looked at Anna, and they kind of quickly understood what had happened. And Jorge, he just started laughing at her, and he said, oh boy, now you've upset the evil spirits in this town. You better put that back together. Now, Anna was trying to make light of this, but she was totally panicking and did not like the fact that she had just desecrated a gravesite in a potentially haunted town. And so she began picking up the headstone and trying to put the stone back on top, but it was no use. It was totally broken. And so as Anna continued to fumble with this headstone, and as Jorge continued to laugh and harass her about all the evil spirits that were going to attack her because of what she did, Jorge's girlfriend, Sophia, who was right next to him, she started getting on edge, and she said, hey, Jorge, is it true that this place is haunted? I mean, really, is this actually a haunted town? I mean, what's the deal? And Jorge, at this point, he stops laughing at Anna, and he turns to Sophia, and he goes, yeah, I think this place really is haunted. And then he would tell them the story of how La Musara came to be known as a haunted town. Back in October of 1873, there was a civil war happening in this part of Spain. And one of the rival armies was using the caves in the mountainside kind of near La Musara as sort of makeshift field hospitals for their wounded. And one night, a very famous general named Cercos was wounded in battle. He was brought into one of these caves, and that was where he died. Now, Cercos was a beloved leader, and so the people inside of this cave really wanted to give him a proper burial, but they knew they had to keep his death a secret, because if it got out to the rest of the men that their leader had died, it would be totally demoralizing and it would really give their enemies a victory. And so the 6 people inside of this cave, they built a coffin and placed Cercos inside of it. And then early the next morning, when it was still dark out, these 6 carried the coffin with Cercos inside of it up into La Musara, and they buried him secretly in the cemetery behind the church. Weeks later, 5 armed rival soldiers climbed up the mountain into La Musara to look for General Cercos. They didn't know that he had died in that battle. In fact, really, besides those 6 people that saw him die and secretly buried him, nobody knew he was dead. And so these soldiers actually thought Cercos was hiding out in La Musara. And so these soldiers began busting into all the civilians' homes in La Musara and ripping them apart looking for this general, and they'd send the people out into the streets and tell them they're going to kill them unless they give up information about where this general is. And finally, after about an hour of this, an elderly man who lived in La Musara had just had enough, and he stepped forward and he told the rival soldiers that General Cercos was dead, that he was buried in the cemetery behind their church. But the rival soldiers didn't believe the man. They said, okay, show us proof. But the elderly man said, well, I don't know exactly where he was buried in the cemetery. I just heard that's where he was buried. And so the soldier said, okay, get everybody over to the cemetery right now. And so all the townspeople made their way over to the cemetery, and the soldiers followed them. And then once they were there, the soldiers demanded that the townspeople begin basically digging up all the graves to find Cercos. And as the townspeople began to dig, the sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder and louder, until finally the leader of these rival soldiers actually stepped away from all the chaos happening in the cemetery and walked over to the pond and began firing his gun into the water to get the frogs to stop. But they wouldn't. They actually only got louder and louder. And so the leader of these rival soldiers finally just gives up on trying to quiet down these frogs, and he turns around and walks back into the cemetery, and he finds all the townspeople have stopped digging. They've basically dug up every grave, and they haven't found Sirkos, and they're just kind of waiting to see what happens next. But the leader, as he looked across this graveyard, he noticed there was one grave that very conspicuously had not been touched. Everything around it had been dug up, but not this. No one had touched that grave. And so the leader said, "Go, dig that one up." But immediately the townspeople kind of took a step back and acted like, "No way, we're not going near that grave." And so finally a townsperson actually stepped forward and said to the leader of these rival soldiers that that grave contained this old woman who had died recently, who everyone suspected of being a witch. And so it was dangerous to try to dig her up. But the rival soldiers did not care at all about this. They just raised their guns and demanded the townspeople dig that grave up immediately. And so they would. They would go over, they would unearth this coffin, and then the rival soldiers would pop open the lid. And as soon as it was open, everybody went silent. Because this woman, who had died weeks earlier, looked totally preserved. She was laying on her back and her skin was very pale, but it had not begun to rot yet. Even her cheeks still had a kind of pinkish hue to them, and her lips were open partway, as if she had been buried mid-sentence. But what really had startled the group into silence was this woman's eyes were wide open when they opened up this coffin. It looked like she was looking directly at all of them. And so after a couple of seconds of the silence from seeing this woman for the first time, the townspeople began to cry and scream and back up away from this coffin. And the rival soldiers, they were startled too by this woman's appearance, but they were more angry than anything else, because by finding this woman in this grave, it meant they had not found the general. And so out of frustration, the rival soldiers grabbed this old woman's body, this witch's body, and they pulled her out of her grave, they strung her up to a tree, and they just sat there shooting at her constantly until her body had basically been obliterated by all the bullets. And then finally, when the soldiers stopped shooting, they realized everything had gone quiet. Just a second earlier, the cacophony of these frogs croaking in the pond that had been so loud it was like totally overwhelming had now completely ceased, and it was like the town had gone absolutely still. And this stillness and quietness was so unsettling for these soldiers that they actually just turned and fled right there without saying a word to the townspeople. And then once the soldiers were all gone, the townspeople got to work reburying their dead. And at some point, one of the townspeople jumped into the grave where the witch had been, and when they landed in the dirt at the bottom, their foot actually sunk down an extra foot. They had landed on something hollow and crashed into it. And what it was another coffin. There was another coffin buried below this woman's that the soldiers had not seen. And this secret coffin belonged to General Sirkos. When those 6 people had secretly buried General Sirkos, they had just placed his coffin at the bottom of an open grave that was about to be filled with somebody else's coffin. They put it in, they covered up his coffin with enough dirt that no one could see it, and then the next day, the townspeople lowered the witch in her coffin into that grave without realizing General Sirkos was below it, and then they filled it in, and then they placed a headstone on her grave, but because they thought she was a witch, they decided not to write her name on the headstone. Instead, they just etched a horizontal line across her headstone. And so after this incident with the rival soldiers desecrating this woman's grave and her body, La Musara was never the same. People in the town began dying left and right, and their soil went bad, so they couldn't plant any crops, and then all these insects came through the town, and then all these plagues of illnesses and diseases came through. And so it wasn't long before La Musara had developed this reputation of being cursed. And by the 1950s, that curse apparently had driven the last few people out, officially making it a ghost town. After Jorge wrapped up the story, Anna was just horrified, looking straight down at the ground, because it would turn out the gravestone that she had accidentally knocked over and broken, well, it had a horizontal line etched across the middle of it. It was the witch's headstone. That was the one she had broken. And so, suddenly feeling totally spooked, Anna was about to yell to Jorge and Sofia that she wants to leave now, when she happened to glance over at the base of one of the cemetery walls, and she saw the perfect bloody milk cap mushroom, the exact type she knew her husband was looking for. And so Anna walked over, she picked this mushroom, and she turned around to show it to Enrique, but Enrique was not in the cemetery. And so right away, Anna thought, wait, did my husband ever actually follow me back down into the cemetery after I saw him by the church? She couldn't remember. She thought he followed her, but she wasn't sure. And so Anna yelled out for Enrique, but he never called back. And so she turned and looked over at Sofia and Jorge, who she could barely see through the fog. And she asked them, hey, have you seen my husband? Is he in here? Did you see where he went? And they both said, no, we have no idea. And so Anna, who at this point was now really starting to panic because this whole situation in La Musara was getting pretty spooky for her. And so she just dropped the mushroom and took off running out of the cemetery. Now, Sofia and Jorge did not really know what was going on. They didn't understand the urgency that Anna was feeling to find Enrique. And so they saw her take off to go find Enrique, and they just kind of casually walked on after her. And when they turned the corner and they exited the cemetery and began walking basically alongside the church, now again, the visibility is terrible from all this fog, as they moved along, they couldn't see Anna or Enrique, but they could hear Anna calling out for Enrique over and over again. And as they moved, Sofia and Jorge, they would see these shadows moving around in the fog. And they would think it was Enrique or Anna, but as they got up to where these shadows were, there'd be nothing there. And so Sofia, she began grabbing tighter and tighter onto Jorge's arm, and Jorge, who had been kind of joking about how this place was evil, was also now starting to feel a little bit spooked about what was going on. And so they began walking a little bit faster and faster in the direction of Anna's voice. And as Sofia and Jorge got closer and closer to Anna, the sound of the frogs in that pond began to get louder and louder and louder until Jorge and Sofia could barely hear Anna over the sound of these frogs. And then just like that, the frogs stopped. And all Sofia and Jorge could hear was the sound now of Anna crying. Now, Jorge and Sofia could not actually see Anna because of the fog, but they walked in the direction of her voice, and they ultimately found Anna crouched down with her back to them right in the spot where Enrique had previously been standing staring in that church window. And so Sofia and Jorge, they walked up to Anna and they reached down and they put their hands on her shoulder. And when Anna turned around, she was clutching Enrique's wicker basket containing all of his mushrooms. And with tears coming down Anna's eyes, she would say to her friends, "He's gone." Anna, Jorge, and Sofia would spend the next hour searching in vain for Enrique in La Musara. Remember, there's no visibility from the fog, and now it's getting dark, and so it's really hard to conduct a search for someone. And so after this hour was up, even though they had no idea where Enrique was or what happened to him, the friends decided that their best and really only move was to leave and go tell authorities. And when they did that, a massive search was launched all around La Musara for the next week. But despite this huge effort, nobody ever found any trace of Enrique. He just vanished, leaving behind that wicker basket that Anna had found. And so after this week of searching, the authorities finally called it off and told Anna that, most likely her husband must have wandered off and died somewhere, and at some point, hikers will likely discover his body. But Anna could not accept this conclusion, and so she continued to go back to La Musara to look for Enrique. And in January of 1992, so 3 months after Enrique had gone missing, Anna, Sofia, and Jorge returned to La Musara to do another one of these additional searches. And during the search, the friends were walking past the church, and they passed by that same window where Enrique had been standing looking inside, and also where his basket had been found by Anna. And the three friends, as they passed by, they happened to see into the church, and down on the main floor where the pews used to be and where the pulpit used to be, there were these 6 dark figures wearing robes standing in a circle, not appearing to be doing anything but just standing there. And immediately, Anna actually was really annoyed because she figured this must be a group of ghost hunters that were out here looking for something paranormal, because after Enrique went missing, his story made the news largely because he went missing in a town that's long been regarded as being haunted. And so because of his case, you had all these people coming to La Musara to go find ghosts or find whatever happened to Enrique. And so Anna, who was deeply offended by all these people who were coming out to La Musara to look for ghosts, because for Anna, this is not a game. Her husband really went missing here. So she goes right up to the window to tell these 6 people in robes off, get the hell out of here and have some respect. But when she went to the window and was about to yell in, one of the robed figures suddenly turned and looked up at Anna. And immediately Anna backed up because this clearly was not some ghost hunter, because the hooded figure had no face. It was just a dark hole looking back up at Anna. But even though there were no eyes, Anna could tell this thing, this entity, was staring right at her. But before Anna, Sophia, or Jorge could react to what they were seeing inside of this church, from behind them, they suddenly heard this unbelievably loud galloping sound, like all these horses were charging towards them. And at the same time, the sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder and louder. And so Anna, Sophia, and Jorge turned around to see what was going on, kind of expecting to see, a cavalry approaching or something. But there was nothing. All they saw was the fog on the road. And so the 3 friends turned back around to look back into the church, and now these 6 hooded figures were gone. And so suddenly thinking that these figures had left the church and they were coming to get them, the 3 friends did not wait any longer. They turned and just sprinted out of La Musara. Enrique was never found. His wife, his friends, the authorities, they still have no idea what happened to him. There have also been several other people who have gone missing in La Musara, and they too have never been found. 14, Aaron Hedges was 38 years old, he lived in Montana, and he was an avid hunter. During the hunting season, Aaron was known to spend almost every weekend or every other weekend hunting in one particular area known as the Crazy Mountains, or the Crazies for short. The Crazies are a mountain range in Montana that are actually disconnected from the Rocky Mountains. So they're very isolated, and they're beautiful, but they're incredibly rugged and very steep. Aaron knew this area like the back of his hand because he was there all the time hunting. In fact, he was there so often that he began placing caches of sleeping bags, food, water. He cached this all over the Crazies. And he knew how to get to his cache points without the use of a map. He just could look around and know where he was, and he could walk to his cache point. On September 3rd, 2014, Aaron, along with 2 of his close friends, decided to go on a hunting trip to the Crazies for a week. They planned on staying right next to this lake called Campfire Lake, but in order to get to it, they had to hike into the Crazies. You could not drive a car to where they were going to stay. So they got 2 horses and a pack mule, and Aaron loaded much of his gear onto the pack mule. And so they begin this hike up to Campfire Lake. And a little ways into this first day hike, the mule spooks at something and runs away. In the process of running away from them, it ditched all of their equipment all over the place, and they couldn't recover it all. Now, after they gathered up what they could and got the mule back and continued their walk, Aaron decided he didn't feel like going to one of his cache points to try to retrieve an extra sleeping bag, and he said, I'm just gonna use whatever extra gear you guys have, I'll make do. And so they continue on, they get to Campfire Lake, and they set up their camp, and for the first couple of days, everything is going just fine. On the 3rd day, Aaron decided that, you know what? I could tough it out, but I'm just gonna go north to one of my cache points and get that extra sleeping bag and try to get a few other things that were lost and make my living arrangements a little bit more comfortable while I'm here. And so his 2 buddies, they know that Aaron is in this section of the Crazies all the time. And so they didn't bat an eye when he says he's gonna go off on his own. It wasn't a very far distance to this cache point. They said, okay, we'll see you later tonight. So Aaron takes off, and after a little while, one of his buddies, for whatever reason, uses his radio to reach out to Aaron. The walkie-talkies they were using had this LED screen that anytime you transmitted traffic on it, it would register your GPS location and transmit that to the person you're talking to. So when he hailed Aaron at about 10 in the morning after he had left to go up to his cache point, when Aaron radioed back, it showed up on their LED screen that instead of going north to this cache point, he had deviated and gone very far to the east. And he would say on the radio, Aaron would say back to them, hey guys, I got mixed up and I missed the turn to go up to the cache cache point. I'm trying to find the trail to get back to the cache point. But they expect him, based on what he said, that he was just going to turn and go to the cache point and come back to where they were at some point that night. But here's the first weird thing about this case. Aaron got turned around and basically missed the turn at this really obvious fork in the trail. If you go this way, you'll get to your cache. If you go this way, you'll end up where Aaron is, and it's the complete wrong way. And you know it's the wrong way because on your right-hand side, if you're going this way, there's going to be a creek on your right. Whereas if you go towards the cache, you're going uphill and there's no creek. So for Aaron, in perfect weather conditions, to have missed a very obvious fork in the road that he knows well is a little bit strange. Not to mention where he showed up on their GPS when they talked to him on the radio, he was a ways down the wrong direction. He would have been next to that creek for long enough that he should have already turned around. It's like making a wrong turn and going 45 minutes to an hour in the wrong direction when you already know it's the wrong direction. Why are you still going that way? But his friends were not that concerned. They had just spoken to him on the radio. He's saying, I got turned around. They're expecting him now to show up a little bit later in the day, maybe in the evening at some point. So that night when he doesn't show up, they try radioing him and they can't get through to him. And they decide that, you know what, it's not that easy to call authorities. They didn't have cell reception out there, and it would have been about a day's hike before they could even get to a place where they could call authorities. So they decide, let's just stay here tonight. He could show up at any point in the middle of the night, and tomorrow, if he's not here, we'll go looking for him. The next morning, his friends get up. This is on September 6th. There's no Aaron. So they head off in the direction of this cache and they start looking for Aaron. And all day they're calling for him. They're trying to radio him. Nothing, no sign of him. The following morning on the 7th, they do leave the area. They give up on their hunting trip and they head out of the Crazies to contact authorities. Authorities launch this massive search for Aaron. But as soon as they launch this search, this massive storm rolls in, dumping 2 feet of snow within the first 12 hours of their search. So they really weren't able to accomplish much in those first 2 days, which brings us to September 9th. One of the main areas that they were looking for Aaron was following that path that he had gone down, the wrong path away from his cache. They followed that path down along that creek and were looking for anywhere along the creek that he might have been. And there was this cliff that overlooked the creek, and on this cliff, next to a tree, they found Aaron's boots, neatly placed side by side as if put there intentionally. Next to his boots was a very obvious fire pit where someone had started a fire. In the fire pit was a cigarette container that was Aaron's brand. It looks every bit like Aaron had been here, smoked a cigarette, took his boots off for some reason, and had been sitting next to this fire. Also next to the fire was Aaron's Camelback water bladder, as well as some of the straps that went to his backpack that had been burned inside of the fire pit. But there's no sign of Aaron or his remains anywhere near there. Also, the people who found the boots in the fire said that we were in this specific area over the past 2 days. This wasn't here. At this point, investigators believed that Aaron must have been suffering from severe hypothermia, where in severe cases, people are known to actually strip their clothing. And so searchers created a new search area based on his boots, thinking he had to have been at this fire pit smoking a cigarette. He took his boots off because he's got hypothermia, and he wandered off, but he can't have gotten far. We're talking 2 feet of snow on the ground in rugged terrain, and he's barefoot. But despite searching extensively in their new search area, they couldn't find Aaron or any sign of him. 9 months later, a family, the Rhines family, who lived near the base of the Crazy Mountain Range, they were doing their yearly maintenance on their fence that went around their entire property. And one of the family members decided to take a break from the work and walk up into the Crazies just a little ways up to just sit on the mountain and look out across the land. It was a beautiful view. And as he's walking up, he gets about a mile from the property itself, and he spots an orange vest under a tree. And so he figures a hunter must have lost their gear. So he walks up and he sees that not only is there an orange hunting vest laying on the ground, but there is a backpack that would turn out to be Aaron Hedges' backpack leaning up against a tree, as if placed there on purpose. Inside of the pack was Aaron Hedges' wallet and license, along with a loaded gun and food and water. Next to the pack, there was this rock. And on the rock was a thermos that was open, along with an open energy drink, as if Aaron had set his pack down and then sat on this rock and was sipping an energy drink out of his thermos. If Aaron had been sitting on that rock, as it appears he was, You can clearly see the Rhines property a mile away from you. It's right in front of you. It would be impossible not to see. Additionally, this location was 6 miles away from where Aaron's boots were found. So all of Aaron's gear is brought to the authorities, who go out and they look for Aaron, and there's no sign of Aaron in the area. Another year would go by and a couple of horseback riders would be riding past that same area where the backpack was found, and they see a human skull sitting underneath a tree. Sure enough, it winds up being Aaron Hedges' skull, and his skeletal remains were all there, except for his feet. His feet were never found, but the coroner could not determine a cause of death. So a couple of questions come to mind. How did Aaron, a guy that knows the crazies inside and out, make that wrong turn in the first place? He should have known better. But even if we say he got turned around, it can happen to the best of us, he would have known he was going in the wrong direction because the creek would be on his right, but he kept going because we find his campsite with his boots way down the path that was in the wrong direction. But even if we're willing to accept that as why he was at that campsite, he took off his boots. And then he walked 6 miles in 2 feet of snow to a location that was literally looking at safety. The Rhines property is right there. You have food, you have water, and you're sitting there drinking a drink. You have a loaded gun, you can fire it into the air to try to get someone's attention, but you don't use your resources, you don't go to safety, you die. In 2018, Terrence Woods was a 27-year-old filmmaker / journalist who had, ever since graduating college, traveled the world, filming in locations that are very rugged and sometimes quite dangerous for these documentaries and TV shows that he was known to work on. In October of that year, Terrence was going to travel to Idaho with a production company called Raw TV. They were doing a TV series around an abandoned gold mine called the Penman Mine. Penman Mine was located in an area that is quite rugged in the middle of the backcountry. Terrence had previously worked on 2 different backcountry shoots. One was done in Turkey and the other was done in Alaska. So he wasn't an expert by any means, but he was accustomed to being out in the wilderness to do some of these shoots. Prior to leaving for the trip, he had texted a number of his friends and just said he wasn't really that excited about going on the trip. His friends would later say to investigators that his language was not alarming. He was just kind of complaining about not wanting to go on a particular work trip, so it didn't stand out to them at all. Terrence arrives in Idaho in early October. He texts his father to let him know that he's landed, he's made it to the hotel. Everything seems to be going normally. He was supposed to be there until mid-November, and that's what everybody in his circle was expecting. So on October 5th, when Terrence sent a text to his father that just said, "I'm going to be coming home on October 10th, and there was no explanation, his father wondered why. And so he wrote a response and said, "Why are you cutting your trip short?" But he never got a response because Terrence had actually already left for the day on October 5th to go do a shoot at this mine, and he'd be out of cell phone reception. On October 5th, the crew that was around Terrence all day reported that he was acting very strangely. He was very quiet, withdrawn, wasn't really talking to anybody. And at the end of the day, when they were wrapping up shooting, one of the producers was sitting in a vehicle waiting for everyone to kind of finish up, packing up, and Terrence said he wanted to go relieve himself. And he walked over to the edge of this cliff, and for whatever reason, this producer, he didn't know why, but he just thought he needed to look to see if Terrence was okay. And he turns to look where Terrence was standing at the edge of this cliff, and Terrence isn't there anymore. And he sees Terrence's radio is now sitting on the ground, standing there. And there was just something about the scene that he saw that he instinctively knew something's wrong. And he actually ran up the cliff in case Terrence had fallen off of it. But when he got to the edge of the cliff and looked over, he was shocked to see that Terrence was down there, about 15 feet down, but wasn't laying on the ground like he had fallen. He was sprinting down the hill, not saying a word, not looking up, running at full speed down the hill into the forest. The producer didn't know what to do. He kind of yelled to some other people and said, "Hey, what's Terrence doing?" No one knew. And so the producer and somebody else also began chasing after Terrence. But after a little while, they couldn't catch up to him, and they were worried that by chasing after him, they might scare him. And so instead, they immediately go and they call authorities, and this huge search is launched for Terrence. So for a week, you have all these people looking for Terrence. You have people on foot, you have dog teams, you have a helicopter with infrared technology. You have all these people combing this area, and there's no sign of Terrence. One of the search and rescue officers commented that it would have been so hard to get away from the search because the ground inside of that forest was so covered with fallen trees that there were times where you were just walking on fallen trees. You weren't even touching the ground. And so the idea that Terrence could run in there and effectively evade this massive search that had kind of encircled the area, it just didn't make any sense, but there was just no trace of him. And to this day, we have no idea where he went. There's never been a sign of what happened to Terrence. He just started running away for reasons we don't understand and disappeared. On the same day that Terrence Woods goes missing, 56 miles away in the same mountain range, a 76-year-old woman named Connie Johnson also goes missing under very strange circumstances. Connie was an outdoors woman through and through. She had previously worked as a wilderness ranger for the U.S. Forest Service, and she was known to take young people out on trips along the backcountry and teach them how to survive. Her friends said that she had tremendous survival skills and spent much of her time alone in the woods. Connie was working as a camp cook for Ritchie Outfitters. It was a company that organized hunting trips in the Idaho and Montana backcountry. The camp that she was actually working at was not accessible by vehicle. You had to get there on foot or on horseback. On October 2nd, all of the hunters at the Ritchie Outfitters camp that she was working in left for a 3-day hunting trip. They said bye to her and bye to her dog Ace, and they were gone. She was the only person at the camp. The following day, they got a very strange radio transmission from Connie. They couldn't understand what she was saying. They couldn't tell if she was mumbling or if there was something wrong, or maybe it could have been the radio. But when no one could understand what she was saying, they ultimately said, okay, I'm sure she's fine. And so a couple days go by, and on October 5th, the hunting party returns to the cabin, and Connie's gone, as well as her dog Ace. They're both gone. All they could find was Connie's jacket was laying over her gun that was sitting on a picnic table. That was it. A very intense search was launched that included the National Guard, the Air Force, helicopters, dog teams, ground searchers. They couldn't find her or her dog. And so on October 16th, they called off the search. 3 weeks later, Ace, her dog, would show up 15 miles away from where they had gone missing. The dog was emaciated, but was okay. They fed the dog, and then they tried to get the dog to help them find Connie, but to no avail. To this day, we have no idea where Connie went or why she left the camp to begin with. In February of 2008, the Pilkington family, which was David and Camilla, along with their 2 sons, Timothy and William, who was 7 years old, were on vacation on the west coast of Vancouver Island. They were staying in this tiny little town called Tofino, which was at the end of one of the peninsulas on the island. There was maybe 20 streets in the town. There was only a handful of places that you could stay. Everybody knew everybody on the island. I mean, it was really a tiny place. One morning, David wakes up early and decides he wants to take both of his sons down to one of Tofino's beaches. And so he gets Timothy and William, they walk over and they go down this flight of steps that leads down onto the beach itself. And when they get to the bottom of the steps, William says he wants to stay at the foot of the stairs. Timothy wants to go actually walk around the beach with David. And so David couldn't convince William to come with him and with Timothy. And so he says, okay, William, you stay right here. I'm gonna go with Timothy for a couple of minutes and walk around the beach. So David and Timothy walked only about 10 or 15 meters away from William, who was just standing at the foot of the stairs, just watching his dad and his brother. And at some point, David would say that he turned his back on his son. He said it was maybe for a minute. And he was looking at Timothy and they were doing whatever they were doing. And then when he turned around, William wasn't there anymore. And so David instinctively runs over because there's nobody else down there. There's nowhere really for him to have gone. But he runs over, he's looking on the sides of the stairs. He can't find his son. You know, he's looking where he could have gone, and it only made sense for him to probably go up the stairs. It wouldn't have been long enough for him to get into the water. It had only been about a minute he had turned his back. And so he goes up the stairs, he's looking around, he can't find his son. And this huge search is launched for this boy because this just happened. It's a very small area. They figure they can find this kid. The main area they were going to look was inside of the forest. Tofino had a very dense forest right in the middle of it. And since the beach butted up against the forest, they figured that the boy could have walked up the stairs and made it into the forest in that 1 minute that his father's back was turned. And so after an exhaustive search of this forest and there's no sign of him, unfortunately investigators began to look to the beach and were waiting for a body to wash up on shore because historically the only people that ever went missing in Tofino were either found in the forest or they washed up on the beach. Those are the only two places you can go. There isn't anywhere else you can go. But the boy never washed up on a beach, and they never found a shred of evidence ever in the forest where that boy was. He just vanished. So unfortunately, like basically all of the missing 411 cases, you have a baffling set of circumstances with no clear resolution. We don't know what happened to these people, and we probably never will. But that doesn't stop us from theorizing about what could have happened. So I'd love to hear in the comments, and I'll get back to as many of you as I possibly can. If you want to learn more about Missing 411, I do have a playlist just called Missing 411. Or what I would suggest is going right to the source. Check out David Paulides and his book series called Missing 411. I provided links below of how to get his books. I've also provided his YouTube channel in the description as well. So please go check out David Paulides and his team at Can-Am Missing Project. They're amazing, and it's why we have any of this information to begin with. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, I would ask you to politely take an M67 frag grenade, pull the pin, and gently lob it towards the like button. Also, please subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you have a story suggestion, we have a subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. I check it every single day, and if I intentionally use your story suggestion, I will absolutely credit you. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram. My username is JohnBallen416. I also just started a Twitter account where my handle is also JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok where my handle is MrBallen. So whether I see you on Reddit, Instagram,